Join us as we go exploring the world of Pokemon. Today's story, Hisuian Avalugg and Hisuian Zoroark. As we venture into modern Sinnoh, one of the most prominent features are the Pokemon that are missing, as many of the species that were endemic to the Hisui region unfortunately do not reside there today, as they range from many of the Pokemon that are exclusively found here or were first described here. And as today, we will be venturing into the ice-covered lands where these Pokemon were originally found. As when we look at a map of the Hisui region, one of the most prominent features which led to its ecological differences to modern Sinnoh was the large snow and ice coverage of the region. This area was massive compared to what Sinnoh has in the modern day, and was very important in terms of some of the ecological evolutions that we would see from many of its Pokemon species. As today we venture into the aforementioned Alabaster Icelands, where we will find today's Pokemon that we'll be focusing on. As we head to specifically Avalugg's legacy and find the progenitor of the legacy itself, as deep within the caverns and across the Icelands itself, we find something scuttling around the ground. Something that is familiar sight in other regions, but here in Hisui would take a different turn, as here we find Bergmite. This unassuming ice Pokemon is found in the modern day, and is mostly associated with the Kalos region, which it was originally described in, and found and identified, as this Pokemon usually lives in the ice-covered areas of the mountains and in other regions where it is found. But specifically, we'll listen to the Dex entry of Bergmite when it was first described in Hisui, as it lives on mountains blanketed in perennial snow. It freezes water vapor in the air to make the ice helmet that it dons for defense. As this is actually pretty widely known that this is something that Bergmite does, it was interesting to see that its behavior in the Hisui region wasn't actually as different to its counterparts elsewhere, as for the most part Bergmite obviously remains the same and is described to be almost exactly the same as its Kalos and various counterparts from across the world. But what makes up its special difference is actually in how it behaved and what it consumed, as it was believed that in the tunnels below the Alabaster Icelands there was volcanic rocks and different soil minerals that the Bergmite loved to feast on in the Hisui region. This was a very interesting difference, as these minerals cannot be found anywhere else and for the most part are hard to duplicate around the world, which scientists are still studying to this day, as many believe it was from the originally active Fire Spit Island, which constantly dumped volcanic rock and ash across the Hisui region. As this obviously led to a very interesting speculation as to how this made Bergmite so much more different than its counterparts. But the difference of that question would be found in not Bergmite, but its evolution. Avalugg is a massive Pokemon. When it is found in other regions, it is comparative to ice glaciers, as this massive turtle-like Pokemon is arguably very powerful, as its Dex entries are very simple, as its ice-covered body is as hard as steel. Its cumbersome frame crushes anything that stands in its way, as this Pokemon has been seen reported in many battles where it's taken blows that normally would take out other Pokemon. This Pokemon stands tall and firm and doesn't budge in any instance, as Avalugg is usually trained by those trainers who have the patience to allow its slow speed to show them the power behind its body. As even in oceans and waterways where this Pokemon can be found, it's very interesting that something this big could float, but it does, acting as a glacier and a refuge for a Pokemon that sometimes fall in the water and want to get out, as Avalugg for the most part is uncaring to them, as long as it doesn't hurt them. But when we look at the base form of Avalugg, this first form that was originally discovered and described in the Kalos region, many people didn't believe that this Pokemon could get any more different. However, thanks to Avalugg's legacy and the appearance in the Hisui region, we were about to discover something rather interesting. As we return to Avalugg's legacy, where obviously after named by the Pokemon itself, meant that Avalugg was here. But when pictures of Avalugg were shown to the people of the modern day, they were surprised. As across the mountains in the description, it could be heard as it moved and trudged its way across the mountaintops, plowing snow out of its way. As we finally reach Hisuian Avalugg, a massively different Pokemon than what we were expecting. As in its dex entry, it reads as follows: "The armor of ice covering its lower jaws put steel to shame and can shatter rocks with ease. This Pokemon barrels along steep mountain paths, clearing through the deep snow." As when we look at specifically Hisuian Avalugg, the most prominent features here are the massive coverings of ice that protect its jaws, and they form a rather interesting shape when put together, that being almost the form of what we know as a plow. As when we originally had seen pictures of Hisuian Avalugg, people were originally confused as it looked like this was actually a part of its mouth, when in reality, once other pictures and species were eventually identified, we were able to understand that this part actually comes apart to allow it to open its mouth, almost functioning as a pseudo shield when it wants to bring it up and down. As when we compare it to normal Avalugg of the modern day that's found commonly, it's interesting to see that Hisuian Avalugg is rather different in that it has a slightly stockier appearance, thanks to the fact that it actually possesses its dual rock typing. This is important to understand because Hisuian Avalugg takes a slightly different path than its original counterpart, in that although it does maintain its slow speed and its rather strange, I would say, habits of just simply walking around slow, this Pokemon actually works in a different function, using its jaws as a more of an offensive tool, as the ice coverings allow it to also plow snow, which does technically get in the way of Hisuian Avalugg's body, which is also believed to have changed due to its diet, allowing the rocks and minerals to actually adapt to its body and changing its lower half into almost a rock body, which is very interesting to the modern day Pokemon. It's also believed that the jaws of Hisuian Avalugg were used to crush through the ice, as has been seen with Hisuian Avalugg digging deep, causing cracks to get to the mineral rocks that it consumed normally, as it is believed that Hisuian Avalugg would use this diet to consist more of the minerals that it had already consumed as a Bergmite in order to continue its evolution and can keep its typing consistent, as obviously it needs access to its food. As the rock typing just seems to be a possible result of its diet. But more importantly than that, one thing that was denoted in the history books was the importance of Avalugg, as the people of the Hisui region, specifically the Pearl Clan, worshipped this Pokemon as one of the noble Pokemon that was originally kept by one of the heroes, as a massive Hisuian Avalugg was actually one of the noble Pokemon that was respected, and it was even recorded that it had to be stopped by a hero of some time in the ancient past. It was known as the Lord of the Tundra. Hisuian Avalugg was respected, and it was very interesting. Hey guys, this is obviously the part of the video where I ask you to like and subscribe. It does help out, and I appreciate it always. Thank you so much. This is obviously a part of the 250 sub celebration, so thank you so much as we get into the next part. Thank you. Zora is a timid Pokemon. This disposition seems to be what led to the development of Zora's ability to take on the forms of other creatures. As we focus on the second part of today's story, we look into the Alabaster Icelands into a different location and of the surrounding area, as one Pokemon that is interesting to the entire aspect of Hisuian evolution is here, one that still needs some answers to us in the modern day, as one of the very interesting artifacts of the Hisuian region itself were some of its art pieces, and particularly some of the masks, which is where we first would see this Pokemon's image carved, as we would also hear the legend of a story told by an old man of the Hisui region that would be passed down to generations. As The boy, as a young man, remembers his childhood, where he actually got lost in the Icelands. There he was approached by a strange-looking creature, one he had never seen before, as he would wear the masks of his ancestors that carved of what they believed was a fox demon. This little creature that did interact with him was a small blue, like fox Pokemon, and this creature would go on an adventure with him, as he talks about the interesting journey and the adventure he had with the Pokemon that he would learn later on. But today, we know it simply as Zora. As Zora of the Hisui region is very different than its counterparts we find in the modern day. As if we were to compare it to the Zora that was originally described in the Unova region, we can definitely see the differences, as obviously the main focus is that Hisuian Zora really does possess a very striking coloration to match the snow-capped regions that it belongs to, with its more gray and white demeanor, carrying over the red aesthetics that are carried into the Zora line. It's rather interesting to see that Hisuian Zora is also very different in that it's actually a ghost type, not even closely similar to its dark type counterparts. As if we read in the deck's entry, it's described as a once departed soul, returned to life in Hisui, derives power from resentment, which rises as energy atop its head and takes on the forms of foes. In this way, Zora vents lingering malice. As it was also believed from those that interacted with this Pokemon when they found it in the wild, it was rather strange as it didn't seem to be very violent by its disposition, but if angered, would definitely release the malice that was talked about in the deck's entry. As we learn a bit more of the story and the legend, as it doesn't end there, we know that the boy actually interacted with this fox-type creature for some time, and his bond had grown with the creature for the short time he was with it. But the legend also describes a creature, one that was so terrifying, and the inspiration of the masks. As also in other entries of people interacting in the Hisui region, one thing was known for those that would be lost, is that when they'd run into the small fox-like creature, there was another creature that was not long before it, one so terrifying that it led to the creation of its image being carved in the masks. As many wondered, what was that creature, and how was it associated to Hisuian Zora? When Hisuian Zora would be interacted with humans and other creatures, it was usually clear to see that this Pokemon, although has some power, was never necessarily the most powerful creature, as it was somewhat defenseless. And as it would wander around the Hisuian region, which was obviously more dangerous at the time and covered with snow, it was believed that something was always shadowing the Zoras, as if you ran into one, it never felt like you just ran into one creature, as something would always be lingering just a little bit further away from you. As when we listened to one of the legends, it was said that the person was unsure of what he saw, but from his description, it would be a creature that we'd know all too well in the modern day, but would take a different path to its explanation here. This being Hisuian Zoroark. As Hisuian Zoroark is obviously an evolution to Hisuian Zora, scientists were understanding that this was probably the case, as their parental bonds are very strong, as it is seen in Zora and Zoroark of the modern regions. As its dex entry reads, with its disheveled white fur, it looks like an embodiment of death. Heedless of its own safety, Zoroark attacks its nemesis with a bitter energy so intense it lacerates Zoroark's own body. From this description alone, from the decks, it was clear that those who actually were able to interact with this Pokemon or even capture it were actually somewhat terrified by it, as its striking image and body is something that does invoke some fear, but also some amazement and wonder, which is probably why the people of Hisui carved masks in its likeness. And when we compare it to its counterparts that we know of the dark typing, one thing that's interesting is that Hisuian Zoroark, unlike its Zoroark counterpart, doesn't have this interesting band that restrains its mane. Instead, the Pokemon allows its mane to flow wildly, Also, the wisp's energy are possibly from the fact that it is now a ghost type, which for many cases are still in the understanding of scientists trying to figure out how this process actually takes place, as adding the ghost typing isn't unnormal to some regional variant Pokemon, but in the case of Hisuian Zoroark, played a significant role in its legend and lore and the beliefs of the people of the region. As one thing that's clear is that this is not a Pokemon you would want to run into in the wild, as Hisuian Zoroark was known for its ferocity and anger, and when angered, it would terrify people. As many would even remember the moments and the legends told to them about the Fox Demon, as it was obviously known that the Fox Demon must have been Hisuian Zoroark. As one thing that was displayed is when people would watch how Hisuian Zoroark behaved, it was definitely a super predator of its area, using its ability to disguise itself as its primary way of hunting creatures. As we would see in one of the depictions, it was hunting Snovers, where it simply sneaked up behind them and would ambush them. And this would obviously allow it to hunt prey. But another depiction shows something even more interesting. As Hisuian Zoroark does share the ability of Zoroark, it is able to use its disguise through its illusion ability, as it allows itself to masquerade as another Pokemon. It would obviously wander into groups of other Pokemon, pretending to be them, and at the very last minute spring up and ambush its prey, making this a ferocious Pokemon that you did not want to run into. But for all that, it still was a very loving Pokemon. One of the things that made Hisuian Zoroark a very interesting study by those who were able to capture them was watching how it would behave in tending to its Zora if they had obviously their own offspring. They were very loving and tendering, but obviously overprotective. But with this obviously leads to one big question. With this Pokemon and its line, as well as Hisuian Avalugg and its line, what happened? Where could they have all gone? And ultimately, what led to the decline? When we look at the Alabaster Icelands for both of these magnificent Pokemon, one thing that is obvious is what happened to them, as they were both very specialized, but also they were not too overly specialized, but we have answers to explain what could have happened to both. As when we look at the expanding Jubilife village, it was obviously clear that when we look at Hisui, it was only a matter of time before people started to pour into the region, as once the region had become more settled, it was obviously there to explain that people could live alongside Pokemon in relative peace, but also had to build their developments. As this was probably the biggest problem for specifically Hisuian Avalugg, as these Pokemon were titanic in size. And because they would climb through the snow-capped mountains and barreling through areas, it was obviously hard for them to interact with people, where they would probably want to go through their homes, but now their homes block their paths. Another issue for specifically Hisuian Avalugg is also the possible disappearance of Firespit Island, which many people are still debating to this day, as it is unclear of where Firespit Island went and how it disappeared from modern Hisui. That would become Sinnoh, but it was obvious that without Firespit Island producing more of the volcanic rock that would be important to the minerals of the region as well as its ecology, these Pokemon were on borrowed time. Couple that with the fact that ice was starting to recede as the last glacial maximum for this region started to decline as the heat began to rise. This left Hisuian Avalugg in a very bad place, as with the ice receding and its titanic size going away in its favor, there wasn't much for it to do. As when we get into modern Sinnoh, unfortunately this Pokemon was starting to disappear fast, and unfortunately there was no time for them to actually figure out how to preserve the species, as unfortunately Hisuian Avalugg and Bergmite disappeared from Hisui or Sinnoh altogether. Now, when we approach specifically Zoroark and Zora, we are at actually a somewhat of a conundrum. The reason why this is at a conundrum is that we're not exactly sure if its decline and disappearance was related to the ice region. Now, this is specifically for the reason that Hisuian Zoroark was a normal and ghost type, not necessarily tied to the ice, and with the way of it being a predator, in the way that it could use its illusion, there's a good chance that the Pokemon could have actually just simply stayed in the shadows as it had done for generations. So this obviously led us as to why it's not in modern Sinnoh today, and what could have been one of the big changes that led to its disappearance here. As one of the also interesting factors of Hisuian, Zoroark, and Zoroark is that they were easily able to live among humans far more than people had originally believed. So this is also wondering for us as where did they go? And how could they have left? Well, when we look at one of the massive theories, we actually could see that Hisuian, Zoroark, and Zora may actually still live among us today. Now, this is for those of the faint heart, but hear us out. One of the also terrifying factors of Zoroark and Zora is that they're able to actually transform into humans and take their appearance. Albeit usually with Zora, the tail usually does remain, but that could be covered up. It is completely possible that the population of Hisuian, Zoroark, and Zora had adapted to modern Sinnoh, just pretending to be people, as this isn't actually a different possibility, as one of the things that makes these Pokemon interesting is that they can simply just not mimic human speech and walking around as people. So for the most part, if we were to look at it from the modern perspective, there's almost no reason that we could assume that they could be walking around with us, just simply not talking. So that is obviously an option. Also, we must look at the more spiritual aspect of Hisuian Zoroark and its importance to the people. This is a possibility where maybe the people, as they changed their beliefs, were angered at the Hisuian Zoroark that attacked them and traced them or even tried to wipe them out to extinction, albeit there is no exact proof or showing that this was done, as we just simply start to see that there was some and then all of a sudden people couldn't find any. Which obviously leads us to different theories, which one of the first ones is obviously a part of the more important extinction of the mass species disappearance of the Hisuian Pokemon, as many can be found here in the modern day, but there's no real explanation as to how they got to where they are, or as modern science is understanding it a bit better, explaining that the conditions of how these Pokemon can exist outside of Hisui are able to do it today. As we look obviously at the theory of Hisuian flight, which is one of the bigger ones that we use here in order to explain how a lot of the Hisuian Pokemon made their way out of the region as the region changed, and this is why their lineages do exist in other regions to this day. As obviously with these massive ice surrounded Pokemon in the case of Bergmite and Avalugg, but also Zora and Zoroark not assumingly finding the region to be up to where they would want it to be, could simply have just left, as this is an option to explain why their disappearance altogether from Sinnoh makes a lot of sense, as obviously today you can find people with Hisuian Avaluggs in areas around the Paldea region for some reason where they're able to find them, with no real explanation, as these Pokemon simply appear and people have been able to capture them, albeit unable to evolve them. They're able to find Hisui and Avalugg, which is rather interesting. And people have even been seen with Hisuian Zora and Zoroark, which they have interacted with, found, and captured, and still used to battling in this day, which does allow us to at least say that these lineages did not go completely extinct, and we are able to at least interact with them today. But unfortunately, as we look over the remaining snow-capped areas of the Sinnoh region, it is somewhat sad to believe that we were just so much short of watching these titanic Pokemon clear the snow in the mountains, and also possibly running into the most terrifying but also cute sight of fright you could ever have in the form of Zoroark and Zora. Thank you so much. This has been what happened to Hisuian Avalugg and Hisuian Zoroark. And then this is Brad from the Ad Army signing off. And for all of you out there, to sign on.